have some stragglers coming in, but we felt like we needed to get started. We're so happy to see such an enthusiastic turnout for our semester-long celebration of the humanities at NKU. Viva Humanities! Today is the first talk in a series that showcases the stories of 5 men and women who have used their humanities educations as a springboard for success in their careers and in their lives. When the planning committee for this event first got together to decide who we wanted to speak about the humanities, the first person I thought of was NKU's new president, Viva Mearns. As an English major in college, President Mearns certainly could speak to the value of a humanities education. I was fortunate to have conversed with President Mearns several months earlier about his English studies, though I must admit that was not my first encounter with him. My first encounter with President Mearns was actually a bit of a blur. Let me explain. I woke up one snowy March morning to do my 6-mile run for the Flying Pig half marathon training. And I was really proud of myself because I hadn't run 6 miles since around 1995. And as I was speeding along, or what I thought was speeding along, I saw a blue flash whiz by me. And I saw it was President Mearns running. And I realized that he was running. And I was actually doing something altogether different. Anyway, I finally caught up with the man at an English department reception. And in our conversation, President Mearns was very interested to learn what courses we were teaching, what books we were reading in our classes. And as an English major, he recalled some of the writers and works that he studied as an undergraduate. But what impressed me most was not what he could recall reading, but that he is still an avid reader of literature. When I mentioned my course on detective fiction, he was keen to discuss some of his favorite books and writers. His enthusiasm for reading and for literature was apparent in his animated discussions. And I got the sense that President Mearns has made it a point of keeping literature alive in his life, despite his busy schedule, and despite following a career path that at first glance may seem far away from his roots as an English major. We're so pleased to welcome him here today to share some stories of those roots and what they have grown to become. Welcome, President Mearns.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for that kind and generous introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and it's a pleasure to see so many of our faculty, staff, and our students here with us. It really is an honor to have been invited to give the first presentation in this Viva Humanities series. So thank you very much, Andrea, and your colleagues for giving me this opportunity. So as Andrea said, I've been asked to speak about how my education in the humanities has advanced my professional career. My path to being a president, as Andrea suggested, my path to be president of this university is somewhat of an unusual one. After graduating from Yale with an English degree, I was a high school English teacher myself for 3 years. And then after graduating from law school, I was a trial lawyer for more than 15 years. First as a federal prosecutor and then as a criminal defense lawyer and a civil litigator. And those are not the typical stepping stones that lead someone like me to become a university president. Now, the next 2 phases, the 2 more recent phases of my career as a law school dean and then as a provost, are probably more traditional steps. And the value of my liberal arts education more readily translates to those 2 positions. So I want to spend a few minutes this afternoon talking about how my humanities education helped me as a federal prosecutor, because I suspect that relationship is not quite as clear. I was a prosecutor in the United States Department of Justice for 9 years. For the first 6 years, I was an assistant United States attorney in the Eastern District of New York. And while I was in that office, I principally worked on organized crime cases investigating and prosecuting members of the Italian mafia. Now, by the late 1980s or early 1990s, when I was working on those cases, the mafia as we know it had been decimated in most cities in the United States. But in New York City, where I was working, I was in Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island and Long Island. In those areas, the mob was and still is quite active. The mafia had infiltrated and still controlled legitimate businesses like construction and waste hauling. And the mafia was very active in a variety of unlawful activities like gambling, loan sharking, and drug trafficking. For a prosecutor like me, prosecuting mob cases in that area, it was a target-rich environment. Now, I suspect that all of you have seen movies or read novels about the mafia, like the Godfather trilogy and Goodfellas, and those fictional depictions, as I'm sure you know, are not entirely accurate. They tend to glorify the lifestyles, and these movies and books trivialize the work of the agents and the prosecutors. But they do show that the mafia has a distinct culture. And my liberal arts education gave me the skills to better understand that culture, their history, their tradition, their rules, and their language. And that's where I want to start this afternoon, with a closer examination of their language. As prosecutors, we had to understand their vocabulary, and we had to work hard to understand their use of tone and inflection to impart meaning, because we often use former members of the mafia as cooperating witnesses. When we met with them, we had to understand how they used certain words or phrases to communicate complex messages. We also had to understand their syntax and their special inflection. In addition to cooperating witnesses, we also used electronic surveillance, that is, telephone wiretaps and hidden microphones that we called bugs. We used this technology to secretly record private conversations between the members of the mafia, the targets of our investigations. Now, because these conversations would often contain subtle references and hidden meanings, we frequently had to rely upon experts to help us interpret those conversations. These experts had many years of practical, hands-on experience that enabled them to explain what these mobsters were talking about, to reveal their hidden messages. The process of listening carefully over and over again to those conversations often reminded me of my days studying English literature, particularly some of the classic texts that were written many, many years ago. For example, I have a vivid recollection of first studying Chaucer's Canterbury Tales when I was in high school. Analyzing the unusual speech patterns of the members of the mafia reminded me of studying this classic Middle English text. And to help you see this relationship, I'm going to recite for you the first 18 lines of the Canterbury Tales. And then I'm going to play an audio tape that bears a strong resemblance. You'll see that resemblance. Here's the verse from Chaucer. When that April with his shore sulta, the drucht of March had pierced to the rota, and bathed every vein in sich liquor, of which thereto engendered is the floor. When Zephyrus eke with his sway to breath, and spirit hath in every holt and heth the tender croppers, and the youngest son hath in the ram his half coursey runner. And small foals making melodia that slept in all the nich with open year. So pricketh him nature and here courages, the longing folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmers for to seek in strange strands, to fern hallways, couth in sundry lawns. And specially from every shearer's enda of England, to Canterbury they wenda, the holy blissful martyr for to seeka, that him hath holpen, when that they were seka. I still remember that text, which I first learned in the 11th grade, nearly 40 years ago. I remember it because of how challenging it was to understand the words, that unusual vocabulary. And I remember it because of how beautiful, truly lyrical the verses are when they're spoken aloud. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to play 3 portions of a telephone conversation that the FBI recorded about 30 years ago. One of the participants in this conversation is John Gotti, the infamous former boss of the Gambino organized crime family, and one of the most famous mob bosses in all of American history. Like the opening passage from the Canterbury Tales, this tape is quite memorable because of the subtle meanings that are embedded in the way these men use the English language. So let's listen to that first excerpt together so that you can appreciate the emotional impact of how they speak.
Hello? Willie? Yeah, Tony. Hold on a minute. Hello. Hey, buddy. Boy, buddy, what I gotta reach out for you? 3 days in advance? My wife just called me, John. Your wife just called you? I'm reaching for 2 days. She said she told you yesterday. She didn't tell me yesterday, John. She just told Willie she told you yesterday. You tell me your wife's a liar now? Yeah, well, then she lied because she didn't tell me. She just let me tell you something. I need an example. Don't you be the example. You understand me?
See what I mean? Don't you just feel inspired by the beautiful imagery and the subtle yet powerful emotions in his colorful language? And when Gotti says, I'm looking for an example, it's not readily apparent what he means. In fact, that's why he asked Tony Muscatello on the piece that you heard, do you understand me? Just like the great works of literature, we had to listen to this tape over and over again. And we had to review the transcript repeatedly in order to discern the meanings of his remarks, to understand his message. But I'll play a couple of excerpts from this conversation, and perhaps you'll be able to pick up some more clues about the message that Gotti was trying to communicate to Mr. Muscatello, a man who reported to Gotti in the organizational hierarchy of the Gambino family. See if you can discern the consequences for Muscatello if he failed to meet Mr. Gotti's expectations.
Listen, I called your house 5 times yesterday. Now, if your wife thinks you're a dusky or she's a dusky and you're going to disregard my phone calls, I'll blow you in that house up.
Okay, so we're going to listen to the next excerpt. Now, I understand you don't have the kind of experience that I have. You're not trained experts, you're not experienced prosecutors, but see if you're able to understand the real meaning of Gotti's message. Please play the tape.
This is not a game. I'm not going to reach for you for 3 days and nights here. My time is valuable. I know that. Now, you get your down to see me tomorrow. I'm going to be there all day tomorrow. Yeah, never mind you be there all day tomorrow. And never me have to do this again, because if I hear anybody else calls and you respond within 5 days, I'll kill you.
So I hope by now, by listening to that tape, even just once, that you're able to discern some clues about the important message Mr. Gotti was imparting to his colleague and his good friend. I hope this example gives you some appreciation for the real challenges, the difficult work we faced as prosecutor. It was never easy to understand how these men communicated, and the analytical skills I obtained as an English major were invaluable in this important task. Let me give you another example of the difficulty of proving that these seemingly honest, upstanding businessmen were in fact members of a violent criminal organization. To convict someone of racketeering, it isn't simply sufficient to prove that the defendant engaged in a specific violent act. As prosecutors, we also had to prove that the defendant committed the act as part of his membership in a criminal organization. And that wasn't easy because the mafia is, in every important respect, a secret society. Upon being inducted into this secret society, members took an oath called omerta. As part of this oath, this code of silence, the new members pledged never to reveal that the organization existed. Now, this commitment was very important. In fact, in a secretly recorded conversation, Gotti was overheard several years after this tape explaining to one of his top lieutenants what would happen if one of the other members of the mafia even inadvertently acknowledged the existence of their secret criminal organization. Before I play the next excerpt, let me give you just a little bit more background. The members of these organized crime families refer to their criminal organization as La Cosa Nostra, which loosely translated means this thing of ours. And Gotti said in that conversation I was describing just a moment ago that if he learned that one of his colleagues even uttered the word la, not the entire phrase La Cosa Nostra, but if they even uttered just the word la, that Gotti would have that man killed. So now you can appreciate, before we play this tape, you can appreciate the challenge we faced as prosecutors to prove the existence of the mafia. how can you possibly prove the existence of an organization that is so secret that its members will be killed if they acknowledge its existence, or even just utter the word la? But we were not to be deterred. We were able to overcome this substantial obstacle through careful examination and analysis of other recorded conversations. In just a moment, we'll play an excerpt of a conversation that took place in an apartment above the Ravenite Social Club, which was Gotti's regular meeting place in Little Italy in Manhattan. Unbeknownst to Gotti, the FBI had concealed a bug in this apartment. As we listen to this excerpt, as you hear him speak, see if you can hear the very subtle, the veiled, oblique references to the existence of an organized crime family, to La Cosa Nostra.
I'm not in the mood for toys or games or kidding type. I'm not in the mood for clans. I'm not in the mood for gangs. I'm not in the mood for none of that stuff there. This is going to be a Cosa Nostra till I die. Be it an hour from now, be it tonight, or 100 years from now when I'm in jail, it's going to be a Cosa Nostra. It's going to be a bunch of your friends are going to be friends of ours, the same friends will be friends of ours. It's going to be the way I say so it is, a Cosa Nostra. A Cosa Nostra.
So were you able to pick up the clues? If so, you're relying on the skills, the analytical skills that you are acquiring by studying the humanities. Now, Gotti's speech during this conversation continued for several minutes. In fact, it evokes memories of some of the most famous soliloquies in Shakespeare's dramatic tragedies. Like Hamlet, Gotti wrestled with his fate and the future of his compatriots. Specifically, Gotti in this conversation was trying to decide which members of his large criminal enterprise deserved to be formally inducted into the Gambino family. As he concluded this speech, he used colorful imagery and a common literary device. Let's listen together to this final segment of Gotti's soliloquy and see if you can identify that literary device.
Even some people downstairs now. You know, I know who's some of this rotten, and I know some games. You can, I can smell it. The way the dog senses when the guy's got fair. You know what I mean?
Did you catch it? When he compared his own self to a dog, was that a simile or a metaphor? You know, as prosecutors, we debated these issues for hours. You know, you can't just play these tapes for jurors and expect them to figure it out themselves. So to be a successful prosecutor, I needed the analytical skills of an English major. Let me give you one final example from another audio tape to illustrate the challenges we face. As I played these tapes today, I have displayed the names of the speakers on the screen, but to identify the speaker during our investigations required careful analysis. Now, when my friend and colleague Bob Wallace, when he analyzes Melville's epic novel Moby Dick, he carefully scrutinizes every line. But it really isn't hard to identify the narrator in that novel. Who can forget the opening sentence of that narrative? Call me Ishmael. Doesn't seem to me that it takes a PhD to identify that speaker. In contrast, listen to this tape. There's a hint, there's a clue in this tape that will lead you, if you listen carefully, to infer that John Gotti is one of the speakers. He's very angry because a Greek organized crime family is encroaching upon his territory by running an illegal gambling business in a Gambino family neighborhood. See if you can hear the subtle clue that enabled us to identify one of the speakers as John Gotti.
We got a game there for 20 years. Is this rap these things still? You tell this punk, me, John Gotti, to settle your head off. You're only
Now, as prosecutors, we only had JDs, but we were able to solve this very difficult problem. In other cases that I worked on, I needed the skills you can acquire in other humanities disciplines, like cultural anthropology. Let me give you an example. Before I was assigned to work on mafia cases, I was assigned to investigate the activities of a group of men who had emigrated from Jamaica. That's the Caribbean island, not the area in Queens. They had emigrated from Jamaica to the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn in New York. Local and federal law enforcement agents suspected that these men were dealing illegal drugs and that they were using violence to protect their contraband and their illicit profits. As part of the investigation, we were looking for physical, circumstantial evidence that might confirm our agents' suspicions. Based upon our preliminary investigation, we persuaded a federal judge to issue a warrant that would permit the agents to search an apartment building where these men were known to congregate. In just a moment, I'm going to show you some of the evidence that the agents recovered during this search. The evidence is displayed on a conference table. As you look at these objects, you'll need to summon the kind of experience that an anthropologist would use to draw inferences about the activities of an ancient culture merely from organizing and analyzing the fragments that were recovered from the site of an archaeological dig. From this photo, see if you can piece together any circumstantial evidence from which you could reasonably infer that these men may have used violence or the threat of violence to conduct their business. I hope you can appreciate how hard our job was. I will show you another example from that same investigation that will illustrate my point. In order to conceal the true nature of their activities, this group formed an organization, a club. This isn't a joke. They formed a club called the Crown Heights Domino and Soccer Association. This pretense was very effective in concealing the group's true purpose. To make this device even more effective, they even kept minutes of their meetings to burnish their reputation as a legitimate organization. But when we located these documents and subjected them to careful scrutiny, we found subtle clues that these men were engaged in some questionable activities. Here are a few pages from the written record, from those minutes, and these are from a briefing provided to the association's members by their Director of Security. And then that is the 3 pages in a poster board, and the next one is just 1 page from that briefing. And I want to review a few of the items on this page to see if there is some evidence of this group's real purpose. Beginning with number 6, beware of parked cars with occupants. Now, this entry suggests that this group wanted to protect the privacy of their culture. Those among you might quickly conclude that they were concerned with law enforcement surveillance, but more experienced prosecutors might ask more profound questions like, were they concerned that the occupants of the parked cars might observe their habits and seek to exploit their natural resources, perhaps try to steal some of their valuable dominoes? Let's look at another entry to see if it will provide us with some more evidence. This is number 8. Someone to arrive ahead of the person traveling with ... to pilot to the destination. Notice how careful they are not to reveal the nature of the item that is being transported. This Secretary of Security the Secretary of the group didn't explicitly write down the word or words. He replaced them with dashes. But it's pretty clear that the item must be important or valuable because the members are being told that they should always be with an escort to accompany the courier. Let's look at another entry to see if there is any evidence, additional evidence, of the identity of these valuable items. You should not travel in any car with drugs except a cab. Hold on. Some of you might think that our puzzle has been solved simply because the words drugs is stated. But be careful. Your conclusion might not be warranted. How do you know the speaker was referring to illegal drugs? Perhaps he was talking about medication that you can purchase over the counter at a pharmacy. Before reaching a valid conclusion, you must test every reasonable hypothesis. Another entry may provide some further clarity. Let's read it carefully. Use someone to carry contraband drugs, e.g. a female. Okay, so the word contraband may provide the decisive clue to our initial question, but notice how this rule presents a new question for a cultural anthropologist. Do these men trust and value their women so much that they give them the responsibility of transporting their drugs? Or do these men give their women the courtesy of this responsibility simply to create the appearance of gender equality? Now, perhaps some of you can think of another reason why these men might use their women in this respect. We debated these issues for hours, for days, to come up with the answer to this riddle. So let's examine one more entry. This is number 4. Do not walk with a gun unless it is necessary to do so. Now, the first three examples I gave you are clear dictates, right? They're like the commandments, like the 10 Commandments. But this one requires the club members to use human judgment, to exercise some discretion. Each member must determine for himself when it is necessary to carry a gun and when it is inappropriate to do so. This entry strongly suggests that this society was a sophisticated one, a very sophisticated one. So you can see from these examples, from these two cases, that my career as a federal prosecutor was propelled by my exposure to humanities as a student in high school, in college, and law school. I was successful as a prosecutor in large measure because of this training. Okay, all sarcasm aside, because that's enough sarcasm for one afternoon, I sincerely do believe that I became an effective trial lawyer in part because my education was well-grounded in the humanities. Indeed, on some occasions, the content knowledge from a humanities discipline was directly relevant to a criminal case. And I'll give you one example to illustrate this point. As you may know, the last case that I worked on in the Justice Department was the prosecution of Terry Nichols, the man who helped Timothy McVeigh bomb the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. That crime was, and it remains to this day, the worst act of domestic terrorism in our nation's history. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols killed 168 men, women, and children in that terrorist attack, which occurred on April 19, 1995. They chose that specific day. They chose that specific day because of the historic significance of that date, April 19. As some of you may recall, that day was the 2-year anniversary of the law enforcement siege on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. McVeigh and Nichols were motivated in part by their desire to avenge that event. But for scholars and students of American history, you know that date, April 19, you know that date has much greater significance for our country. April 19, 1775 was the date on which the first battles of the American Revolutionary War were fought. Those were the battles of Lexington and Concord. McVeigh and Nichols chose that specific day because they believed that their attack would be the first battle in the Second American Revolutionary War. Based on their distorted interpretations of the writings of the men who had the courage and the conviction to declare our independence from England, McVeigh and Nichols believed that they were justified in slaughtering public servants and innocent children. And McVeigh and Nichols believed that others would be inspired to join them in a violent campaign to overthrow our democratic government. Let me show you 2 photographs that were introduced as evidence in the criminal trials of Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. These photographs are of the T-shirt that McVeigh wore on the morning of April 19, 1995, as he delivered the massive truck bomb and then lit the fuse that detonated their deadly device. As you see, the front of the T-shirt has a depiction of President Lincoln. Some of you then may also recognize the phrase, sic semper tyrannis. Loosely translated from Latin, these words mean, thus always to tyrants. These words were purportedly shouted by John Wilkes Booth right after he assassinated the president and jumped from the balcony onto the stage of Ford's Theater. Like Booth, McVeigh and Nichols believed their criminal acts were justified in order to protect a culture that they wanted to preserve. This next photograph shows the back of that same T-shirt. The quote from Thomas Jefferson reads, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." McVeigh and Nichols believed that these words justified their attack on our democratic government simply because they disagreed with our government's policies, simply because they felt in some way oppressed. I share this one example to illustrate how knowledge of history and political philosophy occasionally was directly relevant to a criminal prosecution. Fortunately, very fortunately, those instances were quite rare. But more generally, the skills that I acquired by studying the humanities did in fact assist me in becoming a good trial lawyer. A good trial lawyer must know how to craft a logical, persuasive argument using critical thinking skills. I was challenged to develop those analytical skills studying English and history. Those skills were then sharpened in law school, where law professors still teach first-year courses using the Socratic method. A good trial lawyer must also be able to communicate her arguments both orally and in writing. Good advocacy skills are also taught in many humanities disciplines. But I don't believe that to write or to speak well is the most important attribute of a good trial lawyer. Rather, in my opinion, the most important attribute of a trial lawyer is the ability to listen well, and to truly understand. Before trial, a lawyer must listen to her witnesses in order to know how to prepare an effective examination for trial. During cross-examination, a lawyer must listen carefully to the witness in order to frame the best follow-up question. In jury selection, a lawyer must listen carefully to the answers of the prospective jurors to understand their predispositions. And throughout the trial, a lawyer must listen carefully to the judge so that the lawyer knows the judge's perspective, her predispositions. Listening is a skill. Listening is a discipline you learn studying the humanities. When you read a poem or when you read a novel, you are listening. You are listening to the voice of the author with a curious mind and an open heart. When you read original source materials in order to compose an accurate history, you must listen. You must listen to the many diverse voices of the men and women who lived that history. When you watch a play or hear a concert, you are listening. You are listening to understand the playwright's doubts, the playwright's fears, or listening to be inspired by the composer's dreams. As an academic administrator, as your president, I believe listening is a critical attribute. There's a common perception, perhaps a misconception, that academic leaders should generate lots of good ideas and then just set out to implement them. Certainly, I must contribute to the institutional debate, and I bear significant responsibility for the execution of our university's plans. But to participate effectively in the collective leadership of this university, I need to know the men and women who serve with me as faculty and staff. For all of us share in the collective responsibility to propel this university into the future. To know these colleagues, I must listen to them, to hear their concerns, and to encourage their innovative solutions and their creative ideas. And in order to foster a student-centered university culture, I must also know our students. To know our students, I must listen to them, to understand their challenges, and to appreciate their own personal dreams. The humanities have taught me to listen and to value people. The humanities have led me to this place at this time, and for that I am grateful. So then let me just close with one final personal reflection. Nearly 20 years ago, I received this book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. I received this book as a Christmas gift from my father, who died just 11 weeks ago today. For more than 40 years, my father was an educator, a law professor, a law dean, a vice dean of a medical school, and an interim provost. More importantly, my father was a teacher and a mentor for so many students. Over his career, he taught torts, civil procedure, constitutional law, civil rights, law and medicine, and law and biomedical ethics. The common thread throughout his career, throughout his life, was his commitment to justice, equal justice for all people, irrespective of race, sex, wealth, and power. My father's commitment to justice can be traced to his faith and to his passion for the humanities, literature, art, philosophy, and history. On the title page of the book that my father gave me, he wrote a very short, simple note, which reads, "For Jeffrey." My father rarely called me Jeffrey. I was always called Jeff. When he called me Jeffrey, I knew it was important to listen. The note then reads, "Some things are worth knowing and remembering." Now, my father wasn't referring exclusively to this book, to the premise that the Irish were critical to preserving Western civilization. He didn't write the history in this book is worth knowing and remembering. Rather, he wrote some things, plural. Some things are worth knowing and remembering. He was referring more broadly to the full spectrum of history, of literature, of philosophy, to the humanities. And I believe if he were with us today, my father would join our chorus and proclaim, "Viva Humanities." Viva Humanities. Thank you. So they've told me to leave some time for questions. So we have about 15 to 20 minutes for some questions. This is Bob Wallace's chance for a rebuttal. Touche. There's a microphone here. If people have questions, I'm happy to answer some questions either about the tapes or otherwise. I know our students have to get off to class. No, we're good.
If there aren't any questions, we still have a raffle for a Nook.
That'll make you stick around.
So, yes. We do have a raffle.
Looks like the audience wants to go right. Yes, sir. We have to use the microphone because they're transmitting this to other rooms and recording it also, so if you don't mind using the microphone.
In addition to studying the humanities, what was the process that helped you learn to be a better listener?
Well, I'm one of 9 children, and while that often teaches you to get a word in edgewise whenever you can find a little space, I had 7 sisters, and I have a strong wife and 4 children, girls and 1 son. I don't know. I don't know where you acquire that other than by observing the people who you respect and admire and watching how they conduct themselves. So I can't say there was any particular moment where I said, okay, I need to listen. I think it becomes part of who you are as an identity. And again, I think by studying the humanities, by reading, by listening to music or observing plays, you are required, if you're going to absorb it, you're required to sit and listen and think. And by listening doesn't mean you're necessarily passive. There's this notion of active listening and being engaged, which I'm sure you're aware of.
Many students, it's hard to choose a major. How did you go about choosing your English major?
Oh boy. Should I tell them the truth? Okay. So I enjoyed English in high school, and when I got to college, I had taken AP English as a senior, but they wouldn't give me credit towards an English major based on taking AP English. So I decided I was going to go pre-med and be a doctor. So I started in my freshman year. I took many of the courses, including that first year biochemistry class. And I remember very vividly, I was up on Science Hill in New Haven. It was the first week of October. It was a beautiful fall day. The class was 10:30 to 11:45 on Tuesday and Thursday. And I was listening to the professor speak, and there were about 150 students in the auditorium, and I had no clue what he was talking about. At that point, I realized that I shouldn't be quite so vindictive and cut off my nose to spite my face. I literally don't do this. Any of the students who are here, this is not an instruction. I literally got up from that class in the middle of the presentation. There was a problem that we were all supposed to be working on, and I didn't know where to begin. I got up from the class, walked out of the room, walked down Science Hill to the registrar's office, and dropped biochem. And for the next 3.5 years, loaded up on English and history. I'm not sure. So it's okay to wander a little bit, but do it for the right reasons. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on active and engaged listening? You mentioned that a moment ago, it was a fascinating concept that I was listening to.
Yeah, and maybe, this is, I'll describe it because it is similar to the way you might interview a witness or a potential witness in a case. You can't just sit there and say, so tell me what you know, right? because then they'll start talking or they might go nowhere. So I think active listening involves not only hearing, but then asking the appropriate follow-up questions to maybe tease out a thought, or to maybe to ask somebody to explain something more fully. So that's what I mean by active listening. You got to be turning on your brain to understand what they're saying, but also trying to truly comprehend what their concerns are. Because not everyone is saying what they truly mean. You have to observe. In fact, there's a great trial lawyer. If you ever get into a real jam, there's a very good criminal defense lawyer in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you have the resources, I'd encourage you to hire him. But he once told me that in one of his first interviews with any new client in a criminal defense case, he didn't interview the person across the table or across the desk. That he would get 2 chairs and he'd line them close together and he'd sit with the person like they were having a conversation, because he not only wanted to engage in active listening, but he wanted to watch the person's demeanor to try to pick up clues based upon whether the person seemed anxious or concerned. So active listening to me involves using all of your senses as well. Yes?
All right, I'm going to cheat and ask 2 questions.
Okay.
The first one's really quick, though. Is your life better today, in your opinion, because you walked out of that biochem class and majored in English?
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
But here's beyond that. Here's that I can say without equivocation. But here's what I hope that others would say is that by walking out of that class, I've improved the lives of others. That isn't to say that doctors don't do it, but I'm not sure I would have been able to do it as well as a doctor as I hope I've been able to do it as a lawyer and here at a university.
Okay, real question. There's been a bit more talk nowadays coming from, what we might call the captains of industry, directors of corporations, saying how important it is for employees to have critical thinking skills, to have outstanding research and communication skills. And that's great to hear, and it warms the hearts of all we humanities folks, because we know those are the things that we teach people how to do. Yet at the human resources level, at the actual hiring level, there doesn't seem to have been much trickle down of that sort of thinking. And people are really hired for very narrowly defined, very skills-based sort of positions. And so what do you think we can do as educators and as presidents of universities to sort of close that gap and better educate the people actually doing the hiring to better understand what people with humanities degrees bring to the table?
Yeah, well, a couple thoughts, and this might look like we rehearsed this little question and answer, but I actually happened to bring along, this is an article that appeared today in the Chronicle of Higher Education just this morning, and it says, employers and the public favor graduates who can communicate. These are the results of a survey that was done at Northeastern University, and here's the statistic that they lead with. 3/4 of employers agreed with the following statement, quote, being well-rounded with a range of abilities is more important than having industry expertise because job-specific skills can be learned at work. This is a survey conducted of employers as well as the public employers. Let me answer your question by referring to an industry that I know something a little bit about, which is law firms. I was the hiring partner of a major law firm and on the hiring committee at another major law firm. And so I spent a lot of time reading resumes, interviewing law students to try to see what would fit. And I would succumb to the same pattern that all of these these hiring people do, which is, did they go to a prestigious law school? Were they on law review? Those kinds of things. And what I learned more recently, there's a law professor named Bill Henderson who's done very good work in this area. And what he's done is he's gone into law firms to say, let's start with identifying what are the attributes of the lawyers that are successful in your firm. Tell me what those attributes are, not where they went to school, but what skills and values and attitudes translate into success at your firm and your profession. And then let's develop a hiring profile based upon that. And what he found is that many law firms, as you just suggest, there wasn't an alignment with the people who were doing the hiring with the attributes that they needed to be successful. So one of the things in response, what we need to do is have a conversation with employers to ensure that they're aligning their hiring profiles and their hiring processes to meet what they want. Not necessarily what we want or will produce, but as you suggest, to produce the kind of people that they say they want. And that's where I think, and as you might have seen it in the strategic plan, I'll put a little plug in there, that's why I think when we talk about having partnerships and relationships with employers, it's not because we're saying we will do what they tell us to do, but rather so that we can have a genuine conversation and partnership with them to say, we believe we can give our students the skills and experiences that you want, but let's have a conversation about what really would be of long-term value to your organization in terms of its culture and success.
Yes, I have a question. I went to your installation and I was impressed by your emphasis on mentorship. And today, as I listened to you, I'm really struck by your depth, at how you opened and then you closed. And I was really taken by the section where you were sarcastic. And I was just wondering if you could take us through why you decided to put the sarcasm in. What were you thinking about? And I think I have a feeling why, but I'd like to hear what you think.
Well, I'll just say one thing just facetiously. My wife and her children are here. As much as you may enjoy my sarcasm, they have a real limit as to how much of this sarcasm, because they receive it on a much more regular basis. Again, I thought part of it was I wanted to come in and try to enjoy the time that we have together. And obviously I was being sarcastic in the sense of when I was juxtaposing the challenges that we face. There were real challenges. So why did I give up on the sarcasm halfway through? Because there were some points that I wanted to deliver. I wanted to just make reference to the Oklahoma City bombing case. That is an experience for me, not just professionally, but personally, that has had a significant and lasting impact on my life, on who I am. And also then this was a university audience, so thought that this was an opportunity to talk about how I view these skills or these experiences in helping me to serve with all of you. So I wanted to be part playful, but also use this platform to share some thoughts.
Yes, I have a question. I'm an English major, and I was wondering if how you came to, like when you started out as being an English major, how did you decide what you were going to do after that? Because I think there's a big misconception with people outside of the English, major, that there's a very limited career field.
Well, first of all, I'd say, I'm not sure you quite asked this question, but I'll answer one of the questions that maybe you asked. When I was picking the courses that I took in college and also in law school, I didn't necessarily pick the subject. I picked the best professor. I picked the person who I thought I could learn the most from, because although I recited the Chaucer, I can't tell you lots of specific content things that I can remember for English or history, but I certainly do believe that I was changed for the better by being around people who were passionate about what they do and who taught me how to analyze problems, how to solve problems, how to think creatively. So that's the first piece of advice I would give you. Second piece is, while I was teaching English, I was also doing technical writing. I was writing about Saab cars. I mean, I guess it's, somebody's got to write about, well, I guess nobody has to write about Saab cars anymore because they're out of business. But, there are certain technical applications of what you do, what you can do in terms of writing. For me, I taught English, and it was an important bridge between college and law school. I thought as I was ending college that eventually I was going to go to law school, but I wasn't ready personally to go directly to law school, so it was a very valuable experience for me. I guess what I would say, and I don't know if this is being directly responsive, one, don't believe people who say it's a dead-end path. They're wrong. They were wrong then, they're wrong now. And second of all, don't believe that you have to know where you're going to be 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, or 30 years from now. If you asked my friends from college, could they ever conceive that I would be standing at a podium as the president of a university as strong as this one, they would have laughed, right? So if you pursue things that are of interest to you, if you surround yourself with people who inspire you, who challenge you, the rest of it, and then you give your best to those tasks, the rest of it will take care of it yourself. Will take care of itself, and you'll find yourself landing in some wonderful places. I'm being told that there's one more question. I just got or two. quick if I'm quick.
So I'm thinking that we probably went to college about the same time. And we didn't have ratemyprofessor.com when we were in college to choose our professors. So what skills did you use to choose the best professors for you?
Well, and I must confess, when I was in college, it wasn't always the best professor. There was a little bit of time scheduling involved, and when I had more maturity in law school, that was something that I used much more deliberately. And I used it primarily because I developed a close relationship with a very accomplished professor in law school. And I had a relationship with him as a research assistant, and through that time that I spent with him, I was able to get his insight as if I were, if you were me, what courses would you take? And so that's if you're a student developing relationships with faculty members, clearly they're not going to say avoid Professor Jones because she's not very good, but they can give you insights into what your interests are and what your temperament is and help guide you to find those professors and those courses that will help. The relationship, that relationship that I had with that law professor was transformative for me. And those relationships, amount to a great deal. Well, thank you all very much for coming out. I'm delighted that you were with us today. Thank you. Oh, and we have some business. Andrea has some business to do.
This is a gift for you.
Oh, thank you.
It's full of goodies, and there's
All
a
right.
Viva Humanities t-shirt in there for you to wear.
Great, thank you.
Every day.
Okay, good.
Do you have to go?
I don't.
Oh,
Want me
okay.
to pick?
Do you want to pick? Well, see, I fear that so many students are gone that we might be sitting here
we
for
gonna-
hours picking all these.
Are they going to make, do they have to be here? Do they have to be here to win?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Okay, 536074. Last three digits, 074. Pick another one, okay.
See?
These are only for students?
Yes.
Oh, boy. 536130. Maybe-
think.
Maybe we should have all the students who are still here come forward and we'll play Duck, Duck, Goose or something. 536093. Maybe we should do, if you got 5 of the 6 numbers, you can claim the prize. 536045. There it is. All right.
Yes.
Congratulations.